Hi folks, and welcome to this introduction to Roland Barthes' text, The Death of the Author, written in 1967. This is probably one of the most cited and circulated texts in literary theory, and Roland Barthes is probably one of the most cited thinkers in literary theory and theory in general. Barthes is probably best known for his association with structuralism and what's known as post-structuralism. He's associated with both schools of thought. We're going to get to those schools of thought in a little bit, but let's jump right into the text. I want to organize this text into three basic themes or ideas. The first is intentionalism versus anti-intentionalism. The second is structuralism as a school of thought. And the third is individualism or ideology. So first, let's look at intentionalism and anti-intentionalism. The most cited idea within Barthes' text, Death of an Author, is the idea that a text's meaning does not rely on an author's intention. Now, this is a super important idea in the history of literary theory, and it does find its way into this text. But I'm going to suggest that this text is actually not the most famous text for dealing with the question of intention. But first, let's look at where you can find it. So check out this passage. Barthes says, "The image of literature to be found in ordinary culture is tyrannically centered on the author, his person, his life, his tastes, his passions. The explanation of a work is always sought in the man or woman who produced it, as if it were always in the end, through the more or less transparent allegory of the fiction, the voice of a single person, the author confiding in us." So as you can see, the main idea that Barthes wants to bring up here is a kind of cultural intuition that I think you can probably recognize. Certainly I recognize it in my students, I recognize it in ordinary people that I talk to about works of art, be they films or books or poems, which is the idea that an artwork is, of course, obviously, an expression of its author. And following from this is the intuition that an explanation of the artwork, what we might call a reading, a work of criticism, or an interpretation of that artwork, is going to find authority in what the author thought, or meant, or intended. So we can invoke these two terms when we're talking about this question, intentionalism versus anti-intentionalism. Because the question of authorial intent has been such a major issue in the history of literary and artistic theory, art theory, you'll sometimes see these terms, intentionalism versus anti-intentionalism, to name the opposing camps for how we can make sense of the meaning of a work of art. The intentionalists put emphasis on the author's or artist's intent. The anti-intentionalists try to wrest the authority from the author or the artist. Barthes is unambiguously associated with the latter camp, anti-intentionalism. But while his essay Death of the Author might be the most famous text associated with anti-intentionalism, it doesn't squarely investigate that question. In fact, the text that really investigates that question is a text called The Intentional Fallacy by Wimsatt and Beardsley from 1946. It's a major work of new criticism. Just remember that term for now. So I can summarize the argument of the intentional fallacy this way. They say the design or intention of the author is neither available nor desirable as a standard for judging the success of a work of literary art. But I'm not just interested in reiterating their argument. That's apparent from the title of the essay. Let's work through some of the reasoning. So let's just imagine for a moment that the two authors of the text are engaged in a kind of back and forth to illustrate the reasonings of some of their arguments. So one of them says, if your goal is to make claims about what the text means, and here a text could be a poem, a novel, a film, you should restrict your evidence to what is in the text. That's right, any evidence for an interpretation that comes from outside the text, for example, the author's notes, interviews, etc., are by definition not part of the text. To which the other one might respond, yeah, the tendency to draw on the author's biographical detail and interpretation stems from the fallacious belief that the text means what the author intended it to mean. So now I want you to recall any time that you've, say, looked up information about the author of a book when trying to make sense of their book, or something about the life of a director and trying to make sense of their film. That intuition that we have, either whether it's an intuition that we've absorbed from culture or whether we've been taught it from the classroom, is associated with what they're calling the intentional fallacy. I can figure out what a text means if I knew something about the author. A simple example are the final paintings that Van Gogh painted. It's difficult to appraise or interpret those paintings in the same way once you've learned that they were the final paintings that Van Gogh painted before he killed himself. So in response to this question of biographical criticism, the other one might say, as a kind of devil's advocate, but why is the belief in intention fallacious? For instance, doesn't the green light in The Great Gatsby symbolize the American dream only because F. Scott Fitzgerald intended it? So our authors might respond this way. No. What makes the claim the green light symbolizes the American dream a legitimate and reasonable one is the evidence in the text that supports this interpretation. Whether Fitzgerald ever had the thought while he was writing, oh, this green light means the American dream, will not change whether a reader or critic could reasonably make that interpretation. And we might say, what if Fitzgerald said this interpretation was wrong in an interview? Since Fitzgerald, we might say, wrote the book, shouldn't he be the sole authority on what his book means? And to draw on the most famous recent example of authors or artists commenting on their intentions, we might look at J.K. Rowling, who years ago said that Dumbledore was a gay character. And she was widely criticized for this, as you can see, ridiculed even, because people said that they could not see evidence for that in the text itself. So in response to the intuition that what the author says in an interview is authority, our authors of this text might respond this way. Well, no. Why should what Fitzgerald said in an interview count? What if Fitzgerald had said something seemingly ridiculous and without reason or evidence? Say, the green light symbolizes feudalism. Would you accept that? We might think about this and say, no. We've read the book closely, and we see no evidence for that particular interpretation, and so it rubs us the wrong way that the author makes this claim seemingly out of nowhere. But then we might respond this way. But what if a critic or reader made that same ridiculous interpretation? Are you, Wimsatt and Beardsley, saying that the critic's interpretation has more authority? Of course not. The point is not that the critic has interpretive authority over the author. The point is that any claims to a text meaning must be grounded in evidence located within the text itself. And this idea that a text meaning must be grounded in evidence located within the text itself has a name as an ideology. And the name for that is formalism. Now, formalism can mean a lot of different things, even within the humanities, but these two thinkers and the new criticism movement that they're a part of is often associated with formalism, especially this definition of formalism that I'm offering. And so we can kind of summarize the basic argument that Wimsatt and Beardsley are making in this essay, The Intentional Fallacy. The idea is that form, when it comes to making interpretations or readings of a text, matter far more than authorial intention or the author's biography, that is, the things that happen to them in their life. And what do I mean by form? I simply mean the text itself, the way that its parts relate to each other, the fact that it has a structure, the fact that particular words have very particular meanings, the fact that those meanings might relate to each other in particular ways. So now let's go back to our friend Roland Barthes. Now that we've thought about this previous essay from the 1940s, The Intentional Fallacy, we can ask a question. Is Barthes himself an anti-intentionalist, similar to his predecessors, Beardsley and Wimsatt? Well, when Barthes invokes the tyranny of the idea that the explanation of a work of art is always sought in the man or woman who produced it, it seems as if we can suggest that Barthes is an anti-intentionalist. And though the word intention is not even invoked in the text, Death of the Author, we can look to similar ideas about evacuating intention in another famous work, From Work to Text. Barthes says, the author is reputed the father and the owner of his work. Literary science therefore teaches respect for the manuscript and the author's declared intentions. And in this particular essay, Barthes is critiquing this idea. And further, we might look at this little passage from the Death of the Author. A text is not a line of words releasing a single theological meaning, the message of the author God. So it seems that Barthes is really against this idea that a text, a poem, or work of art is a vessel containing a message, and the message was put in there by the author, and the goal of interpretation or criticism is to find the message and verify that message only by verifying that it was in fact the intention of the author. But where does this idea come from? The idea that's in ordinary culture that we've all inherited, not only in 1967, the time that he wrote the essay, but frankly, today. We still very much believe this. Well, one of the major cultural movements in art and art criticism that I think drilled in this idea was Romanticism, which vaguely takes place in the first half of the 19th century. The idea that art contains a message of the author God, I think resonates with William Wordsworth's idea that poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. So Romanticism is usually understood as a backlash or reaction to the hyper-rationalism of the Enlightenment movement. Romanticism wanted to validate and reclaim emotion and feeling. But in doing so, Romanticism asserted a view of art that saw art, especially poetry, as an outpouring of emotion that came directly from the author or the poet. And while this idea is not completely intentionalist, because Romantics often believed that divine inspiration almost happened independently of conscious intention, I think Barthes is partly responding to the idea that a work of art comes directly from the artist, that the artist is like the author God. So to answer this question, is Barthes an anti-intentionalist? I think we're pretty safe in saying that yes, he is an anti-intentionalist. But what about a second question? Is Barthes a formalist, like Wimsatt and Beardsley? Now this I'm not quite sure about. And my first bit of evidence for suggesting this is this strange passage. Barthes says, though the sway of the author remains powerful, the new criticism has often done no more than consolidate it. It goes without saying that certain writers have long since attempted to loosen it. In a parenthetical remark, Barthes invokes the new critics, of which Beardsley and Wimsatt, who he certainly read, are examples. And in the only single invocation of the new critics, Barthes distances himself from them. He says the new criticism has often done no more than consolidate the sway of the author. How could that be so? So here's how I understand this conundrum. I might imagine Barthes as saying this. Though I share the new critics, Wimsatt and Beardsley's, desire to treat authorial intention as an authority, I find them far too dogmatic about the authority of the text itself. In other words, while Barthes may agree with Wimsatt and Beardsley that meaning is not aligned with the artist's intention, he has a much more complicated answer to the positive argument, which is, for Wimsatt and Beardsley, that meaning is always in the text itself. And I'll show you why. Check out this passage. Barthes says, the author's only power is to mix writings. The inner thing he thinks to translate is itself only a ready-formed dictionary. Its words only explainable through other words. So once again, we're getting that anti-romantic and also anti-intentionalist idea where in Barthes' invocation of that inner thing that an author is translating into the artwork, right? The idea that there's a message or perhaps a sense of deeply personal emotions that are being formed into an artwork. He's against this idea. But notice the other parts of this passage. Barthes says the author's only power is to mix writings, that the things that he's translating are a ready-formed dictionary, its words only explainable through other words. What this passage is cluing us into is the intellectual movement that Barthes is most associated with in this essay, structuralism. So let's talk about structuralism a little bit. You might define structuralism this way. It's a general theory of culture and methodology that implies that elements of human culture must be understood by way of their relationship to a broader system. So let's offer another definition from philosopher Simon Blackburn. I quite like this one. He defines structuralism as the belief that phenomena of human life are not intelligible except through their interrelations. These relations constitute a structure, and behind local variations in the surface phenomena, there are constant laws of abstract structure. So the idea here is that things that human beings produce, cultural objects, words, language, artworks, may seem at first like these tiny individualistic, hyper-particular things that don't relate to anything else except the person who put them into existence. But structuralism says no. If you take a farther view of things, they actually relate to each other in sometimes seemingly invisible ways, and those relations form a structure. And almost all structuralist thought grows out of this major text called Course in General Linguistics, which is a structural linguistics developed by Ferdinand de Saussure, in which he writes that concepts are purely differential and defined not by their positive content, but negatively by their relations with other terms in the system. The idea is that the system of language is the source of meaning, not a correlation between a sound and the object that it's referring to in the world. But how do we see this idea of interrelations, which is, I think, a key term in Barthes' writing about the meanings of texts? Look at these two passages. Barthes writes, the author's only power is to mix writings. The inner thing he thinks to translate is itself only a ready-formed dictionary, its words only explainable through other words. Well, the idea that words are only explainable through other words is a deeply structuralist idea, almost indistinguishable from the idea that phenomena of human life are not intelligible except through their interrelations. Let's look at the second passage. Barthes says, a text is not a line of words releasing a single theological meaning, the message of the author God, but a multidimensional space in which a variety of writings, none of them original, blend and clash. So Barthes is trying to get us to see another way of thinking about the meaning or signification of artworks. Instead of seeing the meaning of a particular artwork or moment in an artwork as a message put in there by the author or artist, why not think about the fact that an author or artist is not developing art within a vacuum? Because they are part of society, because they themselves have consumed artworks, novels, poems, films, whatever. They have inherited all these ideas. And so when they go to create their own artwork, they inevitably are borrowing all those particular forms or structures that they've inherited. So instead of thinking about an artist as a sculptor, taking a misshapen mold of clay and taking it from nothing and forming it into something recognizable, we might think about an artist, all artists, as collage makers, borrowing bits and pieces of things that they've inherited from the world, which have structures of meaning to them, and rearranging them. A text for Barthes is a multidimensional space in which a variety of writings, none of them original, blend and clash. Barthes continues, the text is a tissue of quotations drawn from the innumerable centers of culture. So to give you a simple example of what it might look like to look at a particular work of art and think of it the way that Barthes is thinking about art, and also think of it the way that Barthes is reacting to, a kind of author-focused way of thinking about art. Let's just imagine a film, the film Rebel Without a Cause by Nicholas Ray, starring James Dean. Let's imagine two general approaches to interpreting the text. One let's call the auteurist reading. Auteurism is a special word within the history of film criticism that refers to a movement in which critics looked at the directors of films as their authors. And in its original formation, auteurism tends to refer to directors who are located within the Hollywood studio system. So they're operating within intense institutional strictures, but you can still, the idea goes, see the signature of their artistic vision. So let's imagine an auteurist reading of this film, and let's imagine a genre reading of this film. In the auteurist reading, what you're going to do is think about Rebel Without a Cause with respect to the other films that Nicholas Ray, the director, has made. In a Lonely Place, Bigger Than Life, They Live by Night, Johnny Guitar. And as a critic, you're going to develop a set of signatures that Nicholas Ray is going to evoke by virtue of all the films that you've watched of his. And perhaps you might even bring in some biography. You might bring in words that Nicholas Ray has said in interviews. You might bring in elements of his life story. But in any case, when you're doing the reading of Rebel Without a Cause, you're thinking about it as the object formed by the vision of one single man, Nicholas Ray. But notice that you don't have to do this. And many critics and scholars don't do this. They might look at the film Rebel Without a Cause and not think of it primarily as a quote-unquote Nicholas Ray film, but they might think of it as a melodrama. A melodrama is a particular genre, some call it a mode, of fiction marked by a set of characteristics and values and ways of seeing the world. And the first step that you might make to making sense of Rebel Without a Cause is to think about it within the network of other melodramas made within Hollywood and beyond. Films like Imitation of Life, The Bad and the Beautiful, Written on the Wind, Nights of Cabiria. These films are not made by the same set of authors, but people will often group them together because they form a structure. They relate to each other in particular ways that many critics have noticed, and those particular ways in which they relate evidence the existence of a social structure, a structure of value and meaning that we call melodrama. A genre analysis is of course not the only way of doing an analysis that Barthes is going to approve of, but genre analysis is an ordinary example of the kind of thinking that emerges from a general structuralist orientation to artistic production. It acknowledges the idea that texts are tissues of quotations drawn from the innumerable centers of culture.